From the moment you were young, you were taught a dangerous lesson that parts of you were unacceptable. Your ambition was called selfish. Your competitiveness was called arrogance. Your desire for power was labeled immoral. Your instinct to protect your own interests was framed as wrong. So you learned to suppress them. You learned to smile when you wanted to dominate, to apologize when you wanted to advance, to hesitate when you wanted to act. And slowly, you began living only half of yourself. Machiavelli understood this psychological fracture long before modern psychology gave it a name. He saw that societies do not fear weakness, they fear conscious power. So they moralize suppression. They reward obedience. They praise harmlessness and call it virtue. But here is the truth. Most people never confront. The shadow self was never evil. It was untrained. The shadow contains your drives, ambition, aggression, desire, self-preservation, strategic instinct. These forces are neutral. They are tools. What makes them dangerous is not their existence, but their denial. What you suppress does not disappear. It leaks. It becomes passive aggression, resentment, self-sabotage, quiet envy, explosive anger at the wrong moments. Machiavelli observed that people who pretend to be virtuous often become the most destructive, not because they are strong, but because they are unconscious. They act from shadow without awareness, justification, or restraint. The truly dangerous person is not the one who understands their darkness. It is the one who denies it. This is why Machiavelli rejected the fantasy of moral purity. He did not advocate cruelty for pleasure. He advocated clarity over illusion. He believed that power begins the moment you stop lying to yourself about who you are. The shadow self is not asking to rule you. It is asking to be acknowledged. When ambition is integrated, it becomes vision. When aggression is integrated, it becomes resolve. When self-interest is integrated, it becomes strategy. When dominance is integrated, it becomes leadership. But when these forces are denied, they turn inward or explode outward without control. Society benefits from you being fragmented. A divided individual is easier to manage, easier to guilt, easier to shame, easier to manipulate. Machiavelli's insight was ruthless and liberating. A person who knows their capacity for darkness chooses when to use restraint is far more moral than someone who is harmless because they are weak. Real virtue is not the absence of power. It is mastery of power. This is the foundation of the shadow self. Not indulgence, not cruelty, not becoming a villain, but integration. To stop pretending you are less than you are. To stop apologizing for your drive. To stop confusing self-betrayal with goodness. Until you reclaim your shadow, you will always feel internally divided, strong enough to see what you want, but trained not to take it. Machiavelli would say this plainly. You cannot rule your life if you refuse to acknowledge your full nature. And the first step toward real power is this. Stop fearing your shadow, because what you refuse to face will always control you from behind the scenes. If the shadow self is not the enemy, then the real question becomes uncomfortable. Why were you taught to fear it? Machiavelli would answer this without hesitation. Because a person who has integrated their shadow is difficult to control. Societies do not survive by empowering fully conscious individuals. They survive by promoting predictable behavior. They need people who follow rules instinctively, who feel guilt before they feel ambition, who hesitate before they assert themselves. So weakness is reframed as virtue. Obedience becomes kindness. Passivity becomes morality. Self-sacrifice becomes goodness. Meanwhile, power is demonized. Ambition is labeled selfish. Strategic thinking is labeled manipulation. Self-interest is labeled greed. Not because these traits are evil, but because they are effective. Machiavelli understood that morality is often shaped not by truth, but by utility. What benefits the system is praised. What threatens it is condemned. A person who suppresses their shadow is easier to govern. They internalize limits, they police themselves. They seek permission, they feel shame for wanting more. But a person who integrates their darker strengths becomes unpredictable. They can cooperate, but they don't need to. They can be kind, but they are not dependent on approval. They can obey, but only when it aligns with their interests. That level of autonomy is dangerous to any structure built on hierarchy. This is why society teaches you a false binary. Good people are selfless. Bad people are ambitious. But Machiavelli rejected this illusion completely. He saw that the most destructive leaders were not the openly ruthless ones, but the ones who hid ambition behind moral language. Those who claimed purity while pursuing power unconsciously caused chaos, betrayal, and hypocrisy. Integrated power is honest power. An individual who knows their capacity for dominance is less likely to abuse it impulsively. Why? Because they are not afraid of it. They don't need to prove it. They don't act it out unconsciously. The suppressed individual, on the other hand, is constantly at war with themselves. They want influence but deny it. They want advantage but feel guilty for it. They want control but pretend they don't. This inner conflict creates weakness, not humility. Machiavelli believed that pretending to be virtuous while lacking strength leads to collapse, not only politically, but psychologically. When society praises weakness, it produces resentment. Resentment produces bitterness. Bitterness produces sabotage. Sabotage produces disorder, and then society blames the individual. But the individual was trained this way. To be good meant to be small. To be moral meant to be harmless. To be acceptable meant to be manageable. Machiavelli's philosophy cuts through this deception. A person who has the power to act ruthlessly but chooses restraint is more ethical than someone who is incapable of action. Choice requires power. Morality without power is not virtue. It is dependency. This is why integrating the shadow is not rebellionity, is maturation. You stop acting from guilt. You stop performing morality. You stop fearing your own strength. And in doing so, you remove the system's greatest leverage over you: shame. Once shame dissolves, clarity emerges, and clarity is the beginning of real autonomy. Machiavelli knew this truth centuries ago. The world does not fear evil. It fears individuals who cannot be controlled by guilt, fear, or moral illusion. And that is why embracing your shadow is not dangerous to you. It is dangerous to the structures that benefit from your suppression. Most people misunderstand what it means to embrace the shadow. They think it means indulgence, lack of restraint, cruelty, becoming dangerous without conscience. Machiavelli would call this naive, because there is a critical difference between suppression and integration, and confusing the two destroys people. Suppression is unconscious. Integration is controlled. When you suppress the shadow, you don't eliminate it. You bury it. And buried forces don't disappear, they distort. They surface in unhealthy ways at the wrong time against the wrong people. Suppressed ambition becomes envy. Suppressed aggression becomes passive aggression. Suppressed desire for power becomes manipulation disguised as virtue. This is why people who claim to be pure often act in the ugliest ways when pressured. They lack internal control because they never developed internal awareness. Machiavelli saw this pattern repeatedly in leaders. Those who pretended to be morally spotless broke first under pressure. They panicked. They lashed out. They acted irrationally because they had no relationship with their darker impulses. They were ruled by what they refused to face. Integration is the opposite. Integration means you acknowledge your capacity for aggression, ambition, selfishness, and dominance without letting those forces drive blindly. You don't deny them. You don't worship them. You train them. An integrated individual does not act impulsively because they don't fear their impulses. Fear creates urgency. Awareness creates patience. This is why Machiavelli respected rulers who understood cruelty not because they enjoyed it, but because they knew when it was necessary and when restraint was more powerful. He believed restraint without capacity is weakness. Restraint with capacity is mastery. This distinction is everything. A person who is incapable of being dangerous is not virtuous. They are harmless. A person who is capable of danger but chooses discipline is formidable. Integration gives you options. You can cooperate without being naive. You can compete without being reckless. You can assert dominance without insecurity. You can show mercy without fear of being exploited. Suppression gives you none of these. It locks you into a single moral posture that collapses under stress. This is why suppressed individuals often snap. They tolerate, they endure, they smile, they comply, until one day the pressure breaks containment, and then the shadow erupts raw. Uncontrolled, destructive. Machiavelli would argue that this is not strength, it is failure of self-knowledge. The integrated individual does not erupt. They calculate. They know what they are capable of, and that knowledge gives them calm. They don't need to prove strength. They don't need to posture. They don't need to lash out emotionally. They move when it benefits them. They wait when it doesn't. They act decisively when action is required. Integration turns raw instinct into strategy. That is the difference. This is why embracing the shadow is not about abandoning morality. It is about ending. You stop pretending you are harmless. You stop pretending you don't want power. You stop pretending you don't understand the game. And in that honesty, something stabilizing happens. You gain self-respect, because self-respect is born from knowing who you are and being able to control it. Machiavelli's lesson here is ruthless but precise. The man who denies his shadow is weak twice, once in reality and once in illusion. The man who integrates it becomes whole. And a whole individual is far more dangerous and far more disciplined than one who lives in fragments. One of Machiavelli's most misunderstood contributions was not cruelty but honesty. He did not reject morality because he was evil. He rejected naive morality because it was disconnected from reality. Machiavelli understood something that most people resist. Morality, when divorced from power, becomes a liability. Society teaches morality as an absolute good versus evil, right versus wrong, without context. But Machiavelli observed that the world does not operate on absolutes. It operates on consequences. A ruler who clings to idealistic virtue while ignoring reality invites collapse. Not because virtue is bad, but because unprotected virtue is So Machiavelli reframed morality as strategy, not what is good, but what preserves strength, stability, and control. This distinction changes everything. He argued that actions must be judged by their outcomes, not their intentions. A leader who intends to be good but causes chaos has failed morally, even if their heart was pure. Meanwhile, a leader who makes hard, uncomfortable decisions to maintain order may appear ruthless but actually prevents greater harm. This is where the shadow self becomes essential. Without integrating darker strengths, decisiveness, calculation, emotional detachment cannot act strategically. You are ruled by sentiment. You hesitate when firmness is required. You choose comfort over clarity. Machiavelli saw this as dangerous. He believed that pretending to be good at all times forces leaders into hypocrisy. They either break their moral code secretly or lose power entirely. Integration removes hypocrisy. An integrated individual does not pretend to be pure. They accept that morality must bend to context. They understand when mercy builds loyalty and when it invites betrayal. This is not immorality. It is situational intelligence. Machiavelli famously argued that it is better to be feared than loved if one cannot be both, not because fear is noble, but because fear is reliable. Love without strength dissolves. Fear without cruelty. This insight is uncomfortable because it exposes a truth. People respect consistency and consequence more than moral language. When you integrate your shadow, you stop moralizing weakness. You stop using being good as an excuse for inaction. You stop hiding behind ethics to avoid difficult choices. You act with awareness. Sometimes that means restraint. Sometimes that means firmness. Sometimes that means calculated severity, but always with intent. Machiavelli's morality was not about domination, it was about preventing disorder. He saw that chaos destroys far more lives than controlled power ever does. The shadow self provides the capacity to act decisively when hesitation would cause greater harm. Without it, you default to passivity. With it, you gain agency. This is why Machiavelli's ideas still disturb people. They force you to confront this reality. Good intentions do not protect you. Good optics do not protect you. Only strategic awareness does. And strategic awareness requires you to integrate the parts of yourself that can make hard decisions without collapsing emotionally. Machiavelli's morality was not about becoming cruel. It was about becoming effective. And effectiveness, when guided consciously, is far more ethical than powerless virtue. This is the turning point. When you stop asking, is this morally pure? And start asking, does this preserve strength, clarity, and stability? That is when you move from illusion to mastery. And that is when the shadow stops being something you fear and becomes something you command. Ambition is the shadow trait, most aggressively shamed. You're told it's greedy, selfish, dangerous. Yet quietly, the world is run by the ambitious. Machiavelli never condemned ambition. He warned against unconscious ambition, the kind that controls you instead of serving you. There is a crucial difference. Unintegrated ambition is frantic. Integrated ambition is surgical. When ambition is suppressed, it doesn't disappear. It muta. It turns into comparison, bitterness, and the quiet hatred of those who succeed. You tell yourself you don't want power yet. You resent those who have it. That resentment is ambition in disguise. Machiavelli will say this is weakness pretending to be virtue. But ambition, when integrated, becomes one of the most stabilizing forces in your psychology. Why? Because ambition gives direction. It tells you what matters. It organizes your priorities. It forces discipline. The problem is not wanting more. The problem is wanting more without control. Uncontrolled ambition makes you reckless. Controlled ambition makes you patient. Machiavelli admired leaders who could delay gratification, who could wait years for a decisive moment. That patience did not come from passivity. It came from ambition disciplined by strategy. This is how ambition becomes a weapon instead of a burden. First, you stop apologizing for wanting influence, success, leverage, or recognition. Guilt weakens ambition. It fractures focus. An ambitious person who feels shame is constantly sabotaging themselves. You replace guilt with clarity. You ask, what do I want power for? Not to dominate others, but to secure autonomy. Not to impress, but to avoid dependence. Not to indulge ego, but to shape outcomes. This reframing changes everything. Second, you detach ambition from emotion. You don't chase validation. You don't rush outcomes. You don't panic when progress is slow. Ambition becomes long-term orientation, not emotional hunger. Machiavelli believed impatience was the mark of weak rulers. Strong rulers could wait because they understood timing. They knew acting too early destroyed leverage. Integrated ambition gives you that restraint. You no longer need immediate wins. You aim for irreversible ones. Third, you accept competition without hatred. Suppressed ambition turns competition into jealousy. Integrated ambition turns competition into information. You study rivals, you learn from threats, you respect power where it exists. Because your ambition is not threatened by others, it is refined by them. Finally, you stop letting ambition define your worth. This is where many fail. When ambition becomes identity, failure becomes annihilation. But when ambition is a tool, failure becomes feedback. Machiavelli respected adaptability above pride. He believed rulers who clung emotionally to their ambition collapsed under pressure. The integrated individual is ambitious but not fragile. They want more. They plan patiently. They move decisively. They detach emotionally. That is power. Ambition, when mastered, does not consume you. It clarifies you. And once ambition serves you instead of ruling you, you stop chasing power desperately. Power begins moving toward you. That is Machiavelli's lesson. Ambition is not the enemy of virtue. Unconscious ambition is but ambition wielded with awareness, patience, and discipline is one of the darkest and most effective strengths you can possess. Emotional detachment is one of the most misunderstood shadow traits. It is often confused with coldness, with apathy, with lack of empathy. Machiavelli understood it differently. He saw emotional detachment as clarity under pressure. Most people are ruled by their emotions without realizing it. They react instead of choosing. They defend their ego instead of protecting their position. They make decisions based on fear, guilt, or the need to be liked. And that is how they lose power. Emotional detachment does not mean you feel nothing. It means your emotions no longer dictate your actions. This is a critical distinction. A detached individual still feels anger, desire, fear, and attachment, but They do not surrender control to those feelings. They pause. They observe. They decide. Machiavelli believed this ability separated rulers from victims. When emotion governs decision-making, strategy collapses. You overreact to insults. You chase validation. You rush outcomes. You reveal intentions prematurely. All of this exposes weakness. Detachment restores leverage. When you are emotionally detached, you stop taking things personally. Insults become data. Resistance becomes information. Betrayal becomes clarification. Instead of asking, "How do I feel about this?" you ask, "What does this change?" That shift is devastatingly powerful. Machiavelli admired leaders who could execute harsh decisions without emotional collapse, not because they were cruel, but because they understood consequences. They could endure discomfort now to prevent chaos later. Most people avoid discomfort and invite disaster. Detachment allows you to choose discomfort consciously. You can walk away without resentment. You can assert boundaries without anger. You can wait without anxiety. You can strike without rage. This calm decisiveness unnerves others. People expect emotional reactions. When they don't get them, they lose control of the interaction. They reveal insecurity. They escalate unnecessarily. Your detachment becomes psychological dominance, but detachment must be integrated, not used as avoidance. Unintegrated detachment becomes dissociation. Integrated detachment becomes composure. Machiavelli warned against leaders who became emotionally numb. Those rulers lost loyalty because they lost humanity. Detachment is not the absence of empathy. It is the discipline of expression. You still understand emotions. You still recognize suffering. You simply refuse to be ruled by impulse. This is why emotional detachment is a shadow strength. It feels unnatural at first. Society trains you to react, express, confess, and emote constantly. Detachment feels like rebellion because it removes emotional leverage others unconsciously rely on. Once integrated, detachment becomes a stabilizing force. You stop chasing approval. You stop fearing rejection. You stop mistaking emotion for truth. Your decisions become slower but sharper. Your presence becomes calmer but heavier. And people feel it. They sense that you are not easily shaken, that you cannot be baited, that you cannot be rushed. Machiavelli would say this plainly. The person who controls their emotional responses controls the situation, and the person who controls the situation holds power quietly, consistently, without spectacle. This is the gift of emotional detachment, not to become inhuman, but to become unmovable. The greatest fear people have about embracing the shadow is this: if I accept these darker parts of myself, won't I become something I don't recognize? Machiavelli's answer would be direct. Only if you lack self. The shadow does not erase humanity. Unconscious shadow does. Integration is not surrender. It is command. When people reject their shadow, they don't become moral, they become fragile. Their kindness depends on comfort. Their principles collapse under pressure. Their ethics dissolve the moment's fear, or loss enters the equation. That is not virtue. That is convenience. Machiavelli respected leaders who could be humane because they had strength, not because they were incapable of cruelty. Humanity without power is sentimental. Humanity with power is intentional. This is where true integration happens. You stop pretending you are incapable of harm. You stop denying your capacity for dominance. You stop lying about your desire for control. And paradoxically, once you accept these truths, you become less dangerous, not more. Why? Because what is acknowledged can be regulated. An integrated individual does not need to dominate constantly. They do not need to prove strength. They do not need to posture. They know what they are capable of, and that knowledge creates restraint. Machiavelli believed the best rulers were those who could shift between mercy and severity without emotional confusion. They did not cling to one identity. They responded to reality, not ideology. This is the core of shadow integration. You are kind when kindness strengthens bonds. You are firm when firmness preserves order. You are silent when silence creates leverage. You are decisive when hesitation would cause damage, not because it feels good, because it is necessary. Losing humanity happens when power is used to compensate for insecurity. Integrated power does the opposite. It removes insecurity. You don't exploit weakness for pleasure. You don't manipulate out of fear. You don't dominate to feel alive. You act with purpose. This is why integration requires discipline. Without discipline, the shadow overwhelms. With discipline, the shadows. Machiavelli warned against rulers who indulged their darker impulses recklessly. Those leaders burned fast and fell hard. He admired restraint, not because restraint was gentle, but because it was strategic. True mastery is knowing when not to use power, and you cannot make that choice if you don't possess it. Integrating the shadow also sharpens empathy. When you recognize your own capacity for selfishness, anger, and desire, you stop projecting evil onto others. You understand human behavior without illusions. You judge less. You anticipate more. That understanding makes you effective, not cruel. This is the final paradox. Those who deny their darkness often cause the most harm. Those who integrate it often become the most stable, because they are no longer at war with themselves. Machiavelli's philosophy was never about becoming monstrous. It was about becoming whole. A whole person is dangerous but controlled, capable but restrained, powerful but deliberate. And that balance is rare. When you integrate your shadow without losing your humanity, you become something society cannot easily label or manipulate. Not a villain, not a hero, but a strategist. And strategists survive, adapt, and endure long after mortal performers collapse. This is the final evolution, not light or dark, but conscious power. The final stage of embracing the shadow is not domination, it is sovereignty. Machiavelli's ultimate lesson was never about ruling. Others, it was about ruling yourself so completely that no one else could rule you. This is what it means to become unconquerable. When your shadow is integrated, you are no longer driven by hidden impulses. You are no longer sabotaged by guilt. You are no longer predictable through emotional weakness. You act from awareness, and awareness changes how you move through the world. You stop reacting to provocation. You stop explaining yourself unnecessarily. You stop seeking moral permission for strength. Your decisions become quieter but heavier. Your presence becomes calmer but more decisive. Your life becomes harder to manipulate. Why? Because you are no longer split. Most people live divided lives. They want power but deny it. They want control but fear judgment. They want freedom but cling to approval. That division creates vulnerability. Anyone who understands your guilt can control you. Anyone who understands your fear can pressure you. Anyone who understands your need to be seen as good can exploit you. Machiavelli knew this. That is why he believed the most dangerous position was moral dependency, the need to be perceived as virtuous at all times. That need places your power in the hands of others. The integrated individual has no such dependency. They are ethical by choice, not by fear. They are restrained by strategy, not by shame. They are humane because it serves stability, not because they are incapable of force. This is conscious power. Conscious power does not announce itself. It does not threaten. It does not posture. It simply exists. And because it exists, others sense it. They feel that you cannot be rushed. They feel that you cannot be baited. They feel that you will not collapse under pressure. That feeling alone alters dynamics. People negotiate differently with you. They test you less. They respect boundaries they would push with others. Not because you are aggressive, but because you are grounded. Machiavelli believed that fortune favors those who can adapt without losing composure. Conscious power gives you that adaptability. You can be patient without becoming passive. You can be decisive without becoming reckless. You can be compassionate without becoming exploitable. This balance is rare because it requires integration or denial. At this stage, your shadow no longer feels dark. It feels useful. Ambition becomes direction. Detachment becomes clarity. Self-interest becomes strategy. Dominance becomes leadership. Nothing leaks. Nothing erupts. Nothing controls you from below. You are whole. And wholeness is intimidating not because it is loud, but because it is stable. This is why integrated individuals often feel misunderstood. They don't fit moral caricatures. They don't play predictable roles. They don't need to prove goodness or strength. They move with intent. Machiavelli would say, this is the highest form of power. When you no longer need to deceive yourself, when you no longer fear your own capacity, when you no longer outsource your conscience to society, when you no longer apologize for being capable. At that point, the world changes. Not because you dominate it, but because it can no longer dominate you. This is the end of the journey. Not toward darkness, not toward cruelty, not toward ego, but toward conscious mastery. And once you reach it, you realize the final truth. Machiavelli understood. The most powerful individual is not the one who conquers others. It is the one who has nothing left inside themselves to be conquered.